Welcome to the debate. Today, we are looking east. We are dissecting the intricate, really labyrinthine history of Suuri Shosetsu. That's Japanese detective fiction. Now, for the average Western reader, the detective story might feel like a genre that, it peaked with Agatha Christie and then just sort of morphed into the police procedural or the psychological thriller. But in Japan, the puzzle mystery didn't just survive, it evolved into something sharper, stranger, and, well, arguably much more dangerous.
It certainly became more distinct, yeah. But that evolution, it wasn't a straight line at all. It was more like a civil war. We're looking at this deep schism in Japanese literature. On one side, you have the golden age legends of the early 20th century, atmospheric, creepy, culturally dense puzzles. And then on the other, you have the Shin Honkaku movement of the late 80s, which basically said, burn the atmosphere, let's just keep the math.
Math is a bit of a reductive way to put it, but it does bring us to the core question for today. Did the Japanese mystery genre really reach its peak with those classic, atmospheric tales of the 40s, or did the Shin Honkaku, the New Orthodox movement, actually improve the form by rejecting realism entirely to create these pure, high-stakes intellectual games?
Right. It's a question of soul versus structure.
And I'm taking the position that structure is the soul of this genre. I'll be arguing that Shin Honkaku is the superior iteration. It purifies the detective novel. It strips away the literary pretension and the melodrama to focus on fair play and the battle of wits between the author and the reader. It's the mystery novel finally being honest about what it is.
And I will be taking the other side. I'm arguing for the classic golden age Honkaku. And while I appreciate a good logic puzzle, I really believe that earlier traditions pioneered by giants like Edo Gallo Rampo and Seishi Yokomizo offered a far richer experience. They gave us logic, yes, but they grounded it in culture, in history, in a distinctly Japanese atmosphere they called ero-guro erotic grotesque nonsense. They understood that a puzzle without a human heartbeat is just a sterile diagram.
Okay, let's start with that idea of the sterile diagram, because I think that's where the misunderstanding is. To understand why Shin Honkaku was so necessary, we have to look at what it was rebelling against. You can't really appreciate the cure if you don't understand the disease.
You're talking about the Shakai-ha.
Exactly. The Shakai-ha, or the social school. By the 1960s and 70s, the Japanese mystery market was just absolutely dominated by writers like Seicho Matsumoto. These were books obsessed with gritty realism. They were all about corruption, social decay, the breakdown of the family unit. Heavy on the whodunit, the motive, but often really, really light on the actual trick. The puzzle was just secondary to the social commentary.
Well, they were mirroring the times, though. Japan was going through massive industrial shifts, so it makes sense that literature would reflect that social friction. People wanted stories that felt like their reality.
It makes sense for literature, maybe, but it was terrible for mysteries. The genre had completely lost its joy. It became a lecture on sociology. So Shin Honkaku, which just exploded onto the scene with Yukito Ayatsuji's The Decagon House Murders in 1987, was this punk rock rejection of that realism. There's a character in The Decagon House who practically screams the manifesto. He says, "Enough gritty realism. What mystery novels need are a great detective, a mansion, and never-before-seen tricks."
It was definitely a pendulum swing.
It was a restoration. Shin Honkaku treats the mystery unapologetically as a game. It embraces its own artificiality. It offers, to borrow a fantastic phrase from Robin Sloan, math problems that dance. It respects the reader's intelligence by giving them a solvable, complex logical structure without the distraction of unnecessary melodrama. When you pick up a Shin Honkaku book, you aren't being asked to empathize with a corrupt politician's sad childhood. You're being asked to solve a puzzle. The purity of that intent is what makes it superior.
But you're conflating distraction with substance. My argument for the classic Honkaku, the orthodox school from the 20s through the 40s, is that it already valued fair play and logic perfectly well. Haruta Yoshitame defined Honkaku as valuing entertainment derived from pure logical reasoning. So they had the logic, but they didn't sacrifice the setting to get it. They didn't feel the need to turn their characters into cardboard cutouts just to make the trick work.
But did they prioritize the logic, or did they just bury it under layers of Gothic paint?
They enhanced it. Look at Seishi Yokominzo. He's the titan here. His book, The Hanjin Murders, from 1946, is the perfect example. It has a locked room mechanical trick that is incredibly complex. We're talking about strings, screens, a specific rotation of items. It's a heavy-duty puzzle. But it's not just a trick. It is grounded in the eerie music of the koto drifting through the house, this clash between feudal and modern values, and that iroguru sensibility I mentioned earlier.
Okay, can we define iroguro for the listener? Because that term carries a lot of baggage if you just translate it literally.
Sure, yeah.
It translates to erotic, grotesque nonsense. But in the literary context of the 20s and 30s, it wasn't just about smut or gore. It was an aesthetic movement, really, fascinated by the abnormal, the deviant, the eerie. Edgar Allan Poe was the master of this. It's a focus on the uncanny, the feeling that something is just fundamentally off with the world. So when you read a classic Honkaku mystery, the trick feels like a manifestation of a twisted psychology. By stripping all that away to focus only on the puzzle, Shin Honkaku becomes sterile. I mean, even Soji Shimada, the godfather of the new school, he admitted that in Shin Honkaku, characters can act almost like robots.
He did say that, and he meant it as a positive. And he admitted the narration lacks sophisticated rating. I'm sorry, but how is that a selling point? I just don't buy that a robot makes for a superior reading experience. A novel without human texture is just an instruction manual.
And this is where we fundamentally disagree on the contract with the reader. In Shin Honkaku, the rejection of realism, that robot quality, it's a feature, not a bug. Authors like Soji Shimada and Yukito Ayatsuji viewed the mystery as, in Shimada's own words, not only literature but a game. So when you read a Shin Honkaku novel, you are not looking for a meditation on the human condition. You are entering a contract of intellectual combat.
Combat implies two active participants. A reader is usually an observer.
Not in Shin Honkaku. Now, in these books, the author dictates the rules of a specific, often hermetically sealed universe for the specific purpose of tricking you. This is why you see the challenge to the reader inserted right before the solution. The book literally stops. The narrator breaks the fourth wall and says, "You now have all the clues. Can you solve it?" It is a direct challenge. It transforms the reader from a passive audience member into an active detective.
Which is a trope they borrowed from Ellery Queen in the West decades earlier. It wasn't exactly a brand new invention.
Borrowed and perfected. You also have the inclusion of detailed floor plans, diagrams of the murder weapon, timetables. It requires active participation. And the context here matters. This movement rose during Japan's lost decade in the 90s. The economic bubble had burst. There was a sense of nihilism, a real detachment from reality. Shin Honkaku just leaned into that. It allowed writers to detach from the messy, unsolvable problems of the real world, the kind the social school wrote about, and focus on a world where logic always wins, where if you just think hard enough, there is a solution.
That's a compelling psychological argument for why the authors wrote them, sure. But for the reader, a game needs stakes to be engaging. If I wanted a pure logic puzzle with no human stakes, I just do a Sudoku. A novel needs narrative weight.
But the weight comes from the difficulty of the puzzle, the satisfaction of solving the impossible.
That's frustration, not narrative weight. Let's just look at the detectives themselves. In classic Honkaku, you have Kosuge Kindaichi. He's iconic. He wears a serge hakama. He has a stutter. He scratches his head until dandruff flies everywhere when he's excited. He is eccentric, disheveled, and deeply human. You care if Kindaichi solves the case because you like Kindaichi. In contrast, Shin Honkaku detectives often feel like functions. They are just the camera lens through which we view the data. They don't bleed.
I'm not convinced that internal life is necessary for a mystery. In fact,
I think it often muddies the water of deduction. In the Decagon House murders, the characters are literally named after mystery writers: Ellery, Carr, Poe, Agatha. The book tells you right away, do not view these people as human beings, view them as archetypes. This liberation from character building allows for these incredible Rube Goldberg levels of trick complexity that realistic fictions simply cannot support. If you have to worry about whether a character is sad about their divorce, you just don't have the space to construct a murder involving a 10-sided house and a specific rotation of coffee cups.
Rube Goldberg complexity is exactly where Shin Honkaku loses me.
Why? Because it's difficult?
No, because it breaks the immersion. If you have to build a house in the shape of a decagon with rotating walls and hidden passages that require a degree in engineering to operate just to kill one person, it stops being a mystery and it becomes a physics problem. Critics have pointed out that Shin Honkaku tricks are often all but impossible for the reader to reverse engineer because they rely on mechanical absurdities that just do not exist in the real world.
But they exist in the text. That is the very definition of fair play in this genre. The rules of physics in the book might be slightly different or the architecture might be absurd, but as long as the author describes that absurdity clearly, it is fair game.
Is it, or is it just alienating? Classic Honkaku, like the Honjin murders, it uses fair play, but it relies on physical and psychological density. The bloodied katana in the snow, the three-fingered handprint. These are visceral images. Miyazaki Hayao described Rampo's work as beautifully scary. Classic Honkaku engages the emotions and the brain. It's scary because it feels like it could happen in a dark corner of the real world. Shin Honkaku is just an equation. It's dry.
Dry is one word. Clean is another. The complexity is the appeal. The reader of Shin Honkaku is an ideal reader who wants to work. We're not passive consumers. We're performing rational labor, checking alibis, simulating movement through rooms based on the provided maps. Shimada described it as the raw building plans of a novel. Unlike the hard-boiled detective who relies on intuition or, punching people, the Shin Honkaku detective, and by extension the reader, relies purely on data processing. It's a modernization of the genre for an information-heavy age.
I have to push back on that word modernization. You call it modern, but it feels paradoxically antique. It's trying to recreate a golden age that never really existed in that sterile form. And this brings me to the tone. Classic Honkaku had this connection to the Gothic influence. Edogawa Rampo blended Western logic with Japanese folklore, with the bukimi, the eerie. There was a lingering horror of the human mind. Shin Honkaku strips out the folklore to leave only the skeleton. As Robin Sloan noted, it is ice-cold storytelling. The Golden Age had heat.
That ice-cold nature is exactly what allows for the metafictional innovation, which I think is Shin Honkaku's greatest strength. Because the characters are archetypes, and because the world is so artificial, the characters know they are in a mystery.
Which I find incredibly cynical.
It's not cynical. It's self-aware. In the Decagon House murders, the characters literally sit around and discuss the social school versus the orthodox school within the text of the novel. They critique the very tropes they are enacting. This breaking of the fourth wall elevates the genre to a commentary on itself. It acknowledges the artificiality of the murder mystery instead of pretending it's some great tragedy. It allows the author to play with tropes in a way that classic Honkaku just couldn't, because classic Honkaku was still trying to establish those tropes.
But when you make the characters aware they are in a book, you rob the death of its impact. It just becomes a game of Clue. Professor Plum in the library with the candlestick. Who cares if Professor Plum dies? He's a piece of plastic. In classic Honkaku, the death mattered. It was often tied to the decline of the aristocracy or the post-war confusion in Japan. It had weight. It reflected a society in transition.
But let's be honest with ourselves. Mystery novels are games of Clue. We read them to find out who did it, not to grieve for the victim. Shin Honkaku just stopped lying about it. It's the more honest form. And look at the legacy. You can call it sterile, but Shin Honkaku revived a dying genre. The social school had a complete stranglehold on the market. Authors like Ayatsuji and Shimada brought the puzzle back. And look at the impact on modern media.
You're referring to things like anime?
Anime, video games, visual novels. Detective Conan runs on pure Shin Honkaku logic. The Zero Escape series, Danganronpa, which is hugely popular globally, is pure Shin Honkaku. A group of students trapped in a location, forced to kill each other, solving impossible locked-room murders with these over-the-top mechanics. That is the direct descendant of the Decagon House. These works prove that the puzzle is timeless and adaptable to new media. It proved that young people still crave that intellectual challenge.
I don't deny the popularity of those franchises. Danganronpa is a phenomenon. But I would argue that classic Honkaku is the foundation that makes all of that possible. You speak of a revival, but the Yokomizo boom of the 70s proved that readers craved the classic style before Shin Honkaku even existed. It was more than nostalgia. It was a hunger for identity. Yokomizo's goal was to open up the small island mindset, to bring international pedigree to Japanese literature, but he did it without losing the Japanese soul. Modern readers still flock to the Hanjin murders and the Inugami curse. They read them because they want that specific blend of Western logic and Japanese tradition. Shin Honkaku sometimes feels like a universalized logic puzzle that could happen anywhere. A 10-sided house could be in London, it could be in New York. The Inugami family could only exist in Japan.
I see your point about the setting, but I would argue that Shin Honkaku is distinctly Japanese in its rigorous adherence to form. It's almost like a tea ceremony. Every movement is prescribed, every rule is honored. It's a celebration of structure.
Or a suffocation by structure. Classic Honkaku allowed for the weird. It allowed for the grotesque. It allowed for the slasher elements of 70s and 80s horror to creep in, eventually, but it started with that gothic atmosphere. Shin Honkaku cleaned it up too much. It sanitized the crime scene.
It clarified the crime scene. It removed the mud so we could see the mechanism.
But the mud is where the humanity lives. The mud is where the motive lives.
And that brings us back to the fundamental disagreement. You want a novel that happens to be a mystery. You want the mud, the feelings, the dandruff on the detective's collar. I want a mystery that happens to be a novel. Shin Honkaku is the new orthodox because it recognized that the true heart of the genre, the thing that makes it unique from all other fiction, romance, sci-fi, whatever, is the intellectual struggle. It perfected the architecture. It is a schematic that speaks.
And I maintain that while Shin Honkaku offers a dazzling puzzle, classic Golden Age Honkaku offers a complete experience. It retains the roominess of reality. It carries the weight of history, post-war Japan, the fading aristocracy, the clash of cultures. It feels consequential. It's a love letter to the genre. Whereas Shin Honkaku feels like a deconstruction of it.
Well, perhaps deconstruction is necessary to build something stronger. If you don't take the engine apart, you can't make it run faster. But I think, despite our sparring, we can agree on one thing. Both of these schools preserve something that the West largely just discarded.
That is true, yeah. While the West moved toward the hard-boiled detective, the police procedural, the psychological thriller, abandoning the locked room and the impossible crime, the Japanese tradition really kept the flame alive.
Both Honkaku and Shin Honkaku valued the capacity to reason. Whether it's the atmospheric gothic of Yokomizo or the ice-cold logic of Ayatsuji, they both demand that the reader think. They don't treat the reader as a passive observer. They both respect the mind.
Indeed. And perhaps there's room on the shelf for both. You can have the disheveled, stuttering detective in his hakama walking through the snow, and the cool, detached logic of the student sleuth in the Decagon house. They both serve a different kind of hunger.
A fair conclusion. There is certainly much more to explore in these pages for anyone willing to take up the challenge. Just be prepared to do some math.
And just make sure you check the floor plans first.
Always check the floor plans. Thank you for listening to The Debate.